Well, welcome to the White House. Woohoo! Yes, we are delighted to have you here. So thank you all for being here. I confess, I'll explain my outfit. I'm not usually dressed like this. I literally this morning at 9:30 stepped off of Air Force One, as did Valerie, having just returned from the President and the First Lady's trip to a historic making trip to Cuba and to Argentina. So we just literally came down on the ground about 9:30 this morning. So I'm thrilled that we were able to make it back in time to be with all of you, because as Kalisha and Jordan said, this gathering of young women leaders is a critical part of the United State of Women and what we want to do. Before I get to that in a minute, let me just explain the White House Council of Women and Girls for those of you who don't know about the council. It's one of the first executive actions President Obama took back in March of 2009, and that was to create this first ever White House Council on Women and Girls that consists of the heads of every federal agency and every major White House office. So whether it's the Department of Defense, the Department of Transportation, the National Economic Council, the National Security Council, here at the White House, every major part of the federal government is a part of the White House Council on Women and Girls. It's chaired by Valerie Jarrett, who you're going to hear from in a moment. I'm the executive director, and so we lead it out of the White House, but we really operate through every part of the government because the president's message to everyone in the federal government when he created the council was that thinking about the needs of women and girls is something you do and should be doing every day. In everything that you do, whether you're issuing new highway policy, whether you're figuring out how to make sure that healthcare is delivered to people in this country, whether you're figuring out, how to conduct our military overseas. The lives of women and girls, both here in the United States and around the globe, are going to get touched by what you do, federal government, and so you need to think about it. And I have to say, I have been so amazed from day one when all of the cabinet members stepped up. We have people like the Department of Transportation. I tell the secretary of this all the time, that I talk about the Department of Transportation when I talk about the Council of Women and Girls all the time, because, would DOT be the first thing you thought about when you thought about the Council about women and girls issues? No, none of us think about highways. But in truth of fact, they have done an amazing thing at the Department of Transportation as an example. They have made sure that they've got programming for highway women engineers to encourage young women and girls of color to actually become engineers and be highway engineers. They've done stuff. They were huge partners with us on anti-trafficking issues, conducting, bringing in all of the transportation sector, bus operators and train conductors, and getting them trained through their facility as the Department of Transportation to spot trafficking when it happens on modes of transportation in the country. So that's just one example of how every one of our agencies, even in the places you wouldn't think were the hotbeds of women and girls issues, have really stepped up in this administration and done, I think, what we hoped would happen at the beginning, which was, I used to call it, change the DNA of the federal government so that women and girls issues are embedded in that DNA and not like an afterthought, not like something just one office does over here, and if it's a women and girls issue, we'll go talk to the White House office on women and girls. No, it's something that they take very seriously. So I'm really proud, and that means we've had achievements across the board, big and small, in all parts of the federal government. Now, that's one of the things we want to celebrate. The logo just went. What we want to celebrate at the United State of Women on May 23rd here in D.C. And that is to really take account of all of the accomplishments of the last 7.5 years. But more importantly, talk about what works, what we have learned about what are the things that work, both at a national and international level, but also what you're maybe doing in your college campus or in your community that works to improve the lives of women and girls, not just here in the United States, but around the world. And showcase what works. I've sort of been telling people we're done analyzing the problems. We've had a lot of problem analysis. Let's talk about what works, and let's empower people to take hold of change and act on what works. And then let's set an agenda for how we move forward. And young women and your voices are just a key part of how we move forward. So that's why I was so pleased when Jordan and Kalisha put together our, United State of Young Women Forum today. This forum directly will feed into what we're going to talk about on May 23rd, and I want to urge you to be vocal in what those issues are. So at the end of your afternoon, talking about young leaders, I'm really proud that Jordan and Kalisha, so our two young leaders from here at the Council Councilwomen and Girls, and they'll will lead a conversation with you to solicit your input on, what's working out there, what are the questions you have, what are the things you think we ought to be addressing, not just on May 23rd, but in the remaining time we have until January of 2017, and beyond, through this administration and through the federal government as a whole. They'll be joined by Taylor Barnes. I was going to say Taylor Branch for a minute. It was like Taylor Barnes from Civic Nation, another young leader, and Kathleen Biden, the daughter-in-law of the vice president. Kathleen and Taylor are leading an effort at a group called Civic Nation, which is a not-for-profit group that is helping conduct the outreach for the United States of Women and the registration. But Taylor and Kalisha and Jordan, lest you think they're kind of like just doing the work for everybody else, who's more senior perhaps for the summit. No. They are the core. They are absolutely the core of how content and speakers and the issues that we're going to discuss at the United States of Women are getting determined. Jordan and Kalisha are leading that effort. They are the ones who are leading a group of, over half a dozen working groups across the federal government. Taylor is leading the outreach effort to all of the women and girls organizations across the country. So they are really, you all should take, the embodiment of our leadership here and Young Women's Leaders. And so you will be talking this afternoon and giving your comments directly to the people who are making decisions about our future agenda and about the United States of Women. So I urge you to speak out and speak up, and to also stay in touch with us throughout. This is not just a one-day session for you here, but the beginning of an ongoing relationship, or the continuation, because I recognize some of you in the room, the continuation of a long-standing relationship with us. So make sure you stay in touch with Kalisha and Jordan as you have other ideas, or you solicit more ideas from your friends at home. Go to the website, theunitedstatesofwomen.org. You can put input to us there for the summit. You can sign up for updates about the summit. Keep watching. That's going to be a page that will keep changing as time goes by. And we really want this to be something that you own and you can propel forward. So with that, I don't know if I'm turning it over or I can take a couple questions if we've got a few more minutes. Okay, so before I introduce Valerie Jarrett, who's the part of your next program, I'm happy to take a question or two. You can just jump up from your seat right there. Stand up and introduce yourself.
Nicole Rivera, Oakland, California. I wanted to see if you guys were going to live stream.
Yes. So we will absolutely live stream the event on May 23rd, and as we get closer, there'll be information. We will not only live stream the plenary sessions, which will include the President and the First Lady as part of the plenaries, and the Vice President and Dr. Biden as well. We will also have special content that will be only for the live stream audience during the breakout sessions. So there'll be an opportunity for live stream audiences to get unique content and also have, we hope, interactive content. We'll build some interactive content as well during the course of May 23rd. So that's a great question. So if you guys want to organize watch parties, seriously, if you're on a campus, if you're in a community, if you're at a woods, watch parties on May 23rd, a little break from final studying, we would love that. We would love that. And tell us about it if that's something you're planning on doing. Another question?
I have one.
Yes.
How did you become the assistant to the president?
Interesting. Okay. No, it's not. Well, I can make the part of it short. I do this all the time with our interns. I speak every quarter when our new intern class, and that's the first question they always ask. So how do you know? And I always tell people, all right, here's the path, and I can't tell you how to really get to the White House, because I was a lawyer in Chicago. So I was a partner at a big law firm for 23 years, but I always did kind of women's politics on the side and Democratic politics. And so what I can't tell you is I can't tell you how to just meet a guy with big ears and a funny looking name back when nobody knew who he was, and become friends with him and with his wife, who was also an activist on the issues that we both cared about. And then all of a sudden they go to the White House, and then they call you and say, will you come with us? That's actually how I got there. I got here. So there's no real formula that, except for to say what I did. I mean, the way in which I got to know them was, I had a great job that I loved doing, corporate law. right? So I'm one of the few people who stand up here and tell you I actually enjoy doing corporate law at a big law firm. But part of the way I also enjoyed it was that I had this thing that I called my extracurriculars, where I did, all of the work that was my passion around women's issues. I was always very active on women's issues. I go back to like when we were trying to get the ERA, in the Constitution in the 1970s, and on pro-choice issues. And I stayed active, and some of my dearest friends, like the President and the First Lady, and my best friends in life came from that work. So, there are kind of ways to, pursue your passions in lots of different ways, and that often will lead you to unexpected places. And so with that, I'm going to introduce sort of our next segment. There is someone who's been with the president even longer than I have and has known the president and the first lady even longer. She's here and has served as an assistant to the president and a senior advisor. She's also the director of the Office of Public Engagement, and she's the senior advisor for the Office of Public Engagement and for Intergovernmental Affairs, which is all the outreach aspects that the president conducts for the White House. She's really a dear friend. She's really an outspoken advocate across the nation, and especially here within the White House for women and girls, but for all people, of diverse backgrounds and needs, and has been at the center of so much that we have done to sort of diversify and achieve equity and equality in this last 7.5 years. And she's going to be interviewed by Taylor Trudon, who's the Voices editor for MTV News. And so I'd now like to bring up Taylor and my dear friend Valerie Jarrett.
There we go. Hi, everyone. How are we all doing? Good. Feeling inspired so far? I just got out of one of, not a breakout session, but a brainstorm meeting, and I was just saying that it's really, really amazing to be in a room with so many young and powerful young women who have such incredible ideas. So I'm really excited for the rest of the day. But for now, I am so excited to be sitting here with Valerie Jarrett. She literally just got back from Cuba, so a little bit of change of weather. But to start off, March is Women's History Month. And recently, at the beginning of this month, you penned a piece for the Huffington Post, and in it you wrote, "It's a powerful time to be a woman." And I couldn't agree more. We can be CEOs, scientists, mothers, sometimes all three. And there's still a long way, though, for us to go in terms of women reaching equality. And I'm wondering, what steps can young millennial women take to ensure that we have access to every opportunity?
Well, that's a very good question. And first of all, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. We are delighted to have you here at the White House. I know Tina welcomed you warmly, and Tina and I have had so much fun over the last 7+ years working on issues that are important to women and girls. And I always look forward, Taylor, to an opportunity to speak to young women, because I really didn't have that many role models who were doing what I was doing when I was your age. And so one of the advantages of living as long as I have is that then you get to impart advice at every possible opportunity. And so I think the first thing I would say to young women is that you have infinite possibilities. Infinite possibilities. And I think as a young adult, I didn't think broadly enough. And I was kind of at the early stages of my career following a path of least resistance. I went to law school because I couldn't really figure out what else to do. And then once I finished law school, all of these law firms came in and interviewed at my campus. And so I interviewed there. And I wasn't really committed to practicing law at a law firm, but I just kind of went along. And I just didn't really open my eyes until I participated in this program in Chicago called Leadership Greater Chicago. And it just opened my eyes to possibilities outside of my little comfort zone, whether it was the civic community or local political environments or not-for-profits, the museums, the hospitals, the amazing institutions in Chicago. And so what I encourage you to do, and it's easier to do, I think, in a sense, with your generation, is to not look at your career as a straight line and not look at it as though you're going to go like, many people in my parents' generation started at one place and stay there their entire life. You're going to have many, many different opportunities in the course of your life, and I just keep your eyes open. Opportunity never knocks when you expect it. It frequently does not knock at opportune moments. But make decisions that open the aperture of your possibilities as opposed to narrowing them. And then go wherever life takes you. It's an adventure. Treat it like an adventure. And I think you'll enjoy it more. And you can't be afraid to go off track, because I certainly, if I hadn't left my law firm and started working for the mayor of the city of Chicago, I certainly wouldn't be here in front of you today, and I would be miserable in that law firm, I can assure you of that. It's deadly.
So you're senior advisor to President Obama. You are the chair of the White House Council on Women and Girls, and a mom. What is the secret to juggling all of these really important roles?
Yes, well, I often say you can have it all, but not necessarily all at the same time. And so part of why it's easier for me to do what I'm doing now is that my daughter's 30, and has a great career, oddly enough, working at a law firm. I could never have quite figured that out. She always loved the law better than I actually did. She's married, so she's off on her own, and so I have the ability to really focus exclusively on my work, which I love desperately. And I think part of when my daughter was young, one of the many reasons I left the law firm was because I wasn't sure that I could get the support I needed to be a mom working there. And it wasn't the hours, but it was the lack of flexibility. And I was a single mom from the time my daughter was about 7 months old. And so, the Halloween parade was coming around and I wasn't there, there was nobody there. And so those kinds of important, seemingly unimportant, but really important moments in your children's life you want to be there for. And so the advice I give you is to make sure that your employer, whether it's in the private or the public sector, understands your values. And so I mentioned the Halloween parade because when I worked for Mayor Daley, and he was kind of a scary figure, he intimidated me a lot back then. He still kind of intimidates me a little, even though he's not even mayor anymore. But I was in my first meeting with him in my job as his deputy chief of staff. And I think it was deputy chief, maybe actually, it was commissioner of planning and development. And I was making a presentation to him. This was my first week or two in that role. And I was there with the woman who was a corporation counsel, who later introduced me to Michelle Robinson, but that's another story. We'll get back to that in a minute. And Susan, the corporation counsel, and I were sitting opposite each other. We kept looking at our watches while I'm making this presentation, and finally, the mayor realizes that we're not paying a lot of attention to what's going on, and we're looking at our watches, and he said, "So what's up that you're looking at your watches?" And in this moment of truth, I'm telling you, I dug deep, and I thought, well, I could just say nothing, or I could tell him the truth. And I said, you know what? The Halloween parade starts in 20 minutes, and it's 25 minutes away. And Susan and I both have second graders. And he looked at us, and he said, well, then what are you doing here? And the relief I felt, that moment where he was basically recognizing what was important in my life, the most important thing in my life, and giving me that permission and support I needed to do it. And in return, I was so unbelievably loyal. I worked really even harder than I was working before because he understood my priorities. And so I encourage you to not try to do everything all at one time. Because how many of you are moms? It's hard, isn't it? Isn't it? Even if you have all the support in the world. And I was fortunate. I had, I was single. My parents lived a block away. My dad took my daughter to school and picked her up every single day from nursery school until she graduated from high school. Even when she had her own driver's license, she's like, well, why would I drive? I've got him to take me, which was nice, too. I thought that reflected well on her. But even with a lot of support, it's really hard. And I think so many young moms, and I was absolutely guilty of this as well. We're so busy trying to prove we can do everything. And those moms that are making baby food from scratch, it's great if you have time, but you know what? If you don't have time, it's okay. They're really resilient. My daughter never had homemade baby food, I promise you. I had those little jars that I would get, and she was very happy with that. So accept the fact that life is full of trade-offs, and if if you want to do what my path was originally, you want to be partner in a big law firm. If you're in the service business, you have to recognize your schedule is not your own. And so then that means that you're going to have to miss a lot of Halloween parades. But if you decide you want to make a lot of money and be a high-powered position, well, then you're not going to be in the same position as women who spend the first 2 years with their children. Neither is wrong. I think, and we sometimes impose judgments on us, or our friends impose them, or our families impose them. You have to kind of look inside yourself, and you've got to figure out what's right for me, and then ask for help, and recognize, and this is really important, that your career is a long career. You do not have to do everything in like the first 3 years out of school. Take your time. It's okay. And I think if you accept the fact that it's trade-offs, and if you choose, as I did, to have a daughter. I had my daughter when I was 28, I think. And all my friends were still single, and they were going to New York and partying, and I was home. And that's a choice I made. And so I didn't say, woe is me, because I'm home. And I certainly didn't try to go to New York every weekend and party and then feel guilty because I wasn't at home with my daughter. I said, okay, you know what? I have this daughter, and now she's grown, and all my friends their kids are applying to college, and I've been through that. I've been through that 10 plus years ago. So you make these choices, is my point, and I think it's really important to own your choice. Own it and accept it, and don't bite off so much that you are setting yourself up for failure. And if you do fail, just brush yourself off, learn from it, and get right back at it. But I know I just decided I was going to just do everything, and I wasn't going to ask my parents for help, and I wasn't going to, because I just was Superwoman. And at one point, my mother said to me, you're going to start dropping balls. You better ask for some help. And I somehow thought it made me, weak, or I wasn't a grown-up mom. And then I realized, you know what? It's kind of nice when my dad takes my daughter to school. They have a great relationship. They bonded in a way that they wouldn't have. And so, do you get my point? It's like, it's okay to not have to do everything yourself, but own your decisions. And if you decide to do something, don't let anybody else make you feel guilty. If you're staying at home for 5 years with your kids because that's what you want to do, great, because the generations before you have worked hard so that you have a choice. If you decide you don't want to have children, you want to just be totally devoted to your career, don't make anybody make you feel guilty for that either. And if you don't let people feel guilty, you'll make better decisions because they'll be your decisions. What's good for you?
That is
a long answer. I had a lot to say on that subject.
That's some really invaluable advice, and I especially like how you say, don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help when you do need it. I think that's really overlooked at times. But among your many roles and responsibilities, what does a typical day in the life of Valerie Jarrett look like?
Chaos. And I like it that way. I mean, one of the things that I really do not like is boredom. And I have been bored in my career when I was in that law firm. Oh my goodness, I was so bored. I didn't enjoy anything about my day. They were all the same, preparing loan agreements for construction loans for office buildings and shopping centers and hotels. There's like only so many ways you can draft a loan agreement. It's the same 4 issues that are always like knotty, and it was not much fun. And I think what I learned from that experience is that I like to mix it up in the course of the day. And part of the reason I like my portfolio now is that it really covers the gambit. And so one thing I try to do, although walking over here, I said I really flubbed it last week, is I do try to work out early in the morning because you have to do something for you. And it's like my quiet period. I like it when there's no one in the gym but me. I come here, so I can change my clothes and go right to work. But it kind of ground yourself, and I try to do that in the mornings. And if I don't come here to do it, I try to do it at home. And then it could be anything. I could be doing an event like this with women and girls. I could be just returning from Cuba and Argentina with the president and the first lady. I could be working on a variety of issues, paid leave, workplace flexibility, childcare, making sure that we're getting guns out of the hands of the people who shouldn't have them, working to make sure that people have the ability to avoid unwanted pregnancies if they want to. We just came out of a briefing on Zika, and you may have heard the Pope say that in countries where they have Zika, it's okay to use contraception, which is incredible that the Pope said that, but he's recognizing how dangerous it can be if you get pregnant while you've been exposed to the Zika disease. And so I get to work on just a whole range of issues. Criminal justice is a top priority for the president's last year in office, and I've been visiting reentry programs and seeing the challenges that so many people, particularly women who have been victims of sexual assault, and there's a sexual assault to prison pipeline, and you hear their stories of women who are your ages who've already had more trauma than anyone should experience in their lifetime, and they're trying to get their lives back, and they're just looking for that second chance. And we, as a society, create enormous barriers to that opportunity. And there's a reason why the recidivism rate is between 45 and 55%, because it's nearly impossible to get your life back on track. And so we're working on what can we do to make it easier for people who've paid their debt to society to get back, and what can we do to break that early pipeline so that they don't end up in the juvenile and then criminal justice system to begin with. So you heard just like one day of something I might be doing in the course of the day, but I like it, and it gets me out and in touch with such a wide and diverse range of people. And a big part of why I was so excited about taking on this portfolio when the president asked me nearly 8 years ago is because it, as you heard Tina say, the central point of it is engagement. It's getting fresh, new ideas from people all over the country, all over the world, that will push us to make informed decisions. Different perspectives that we may not have had, different priorities that we might have thought, well, all right, there is a consensus for this now, and so we can move the needle, and really figuring out, when you think 8 years is going to last forever, it's really not that long of a time. And so every day and moment is precious, and engaging the American people and engaging a wide range of groups has enabled us, I think, to make the best decisions. Right before you all came in this room, we had what we call Champions for Change, and we've done dozens of them now, where we find folks around the country, ordinary people who are doing extraordinary things. And today we had Champions of Change for people who've really helped get folks registered for the Affordable Care, under the Affordable Care Act. So 20 million people who have health insurance for the first time. And we have this broad network around the country that were working with us on this. And then they were nominated from their communities, and we had 10 people, and we celebrated their incredible accomplishments. And to have them come to the White House and then go back home, and they have this certificate from the White House, and it's terrific. And it's so consistent with the president's core principle, which is that change doesn't begin in Washington. It begins with you. And in order for that to work effectively, we have to be accessible. This really does have to be the people's house. And that's my job. My job is to be that gateway, that open door, that opportunity to engage with us. And so every day is different. Every day I meet people who are remarkable, who teach me things, who push me, some nicely, some not nicely. And that's okay, because that's democracy. It's messy. It's sometimes painful, but over the arc of the president's time here, I think it has enabled us to make better decisions for you.
That's great. As a person who is not a morning person, I really admire your ability to get to the gym in the morning.
What time do you go to bed at night?
Okay, well,
I think there are two kinds of people. There are morning people and there are night people. I'm a morning person. Most morning people are not night people.
that's
Isn't that
fair.
right? And vice versa.
You touched upon it earlier about role models and how you didn't have someone like you growing up to look up to. So when you were young, who did you look up to?
Well, when I say I didn't have people like myself, I meant, for example, I was the first lawyer in my family. Now, my parents both very well educated, but they were academics. My mom started a graduate school in early childhood education, and my dad was a physician. And so when I talked about going to be a lawyer, they really couldn't give me a lot of advice because it wasn't something that was within their expertise. But now what they did do, which was really important, and every young person should have it, and part of our central mission here is to ensure that we provide an opportunity for all of our young children. I always say that talent is ubiquitous. Opportunity, unfortunately, is not. And so we're trying to do what we can to open up those opportunities. But because my parents loved me and they gave me really unconditional love, enormous support, paid for me to go all the way through law school, and their only really expectation in return is that I was going to work really hard, I was going to care about something, I was going to follow my passion, and they didn't care what that passion was, but they expected me to follow it. And that was a very effective role model. I watched my mom work my entire childhood, she worked. But she had a rule, which I then applied to my daughter, which is no matter where she was or what she was doing, if I called her, they'd come find her. And when I was very young, she was teaching in a preschool. And I'd be on hold for about 5 minutes while they walked down the hall and pulled her out of her classroom, but she always came to the phone. And so I had that same rule with my daughter. And I think it demystifies work to young people, and it makes them feel like they can visualize where you are in the course of the day. And that was very cool as well. So I do say my parents were my role models in terms of teaching me to be a good, not just a good parent, but a good person, to look beyond what's in my interest. And I didn't necessarily know public service would be my passion, but I thought my parents lived lives where they did a lot that they thought was making society better, and they did it in the academic arena, and I chose to do it more in the political arena. But I didn't have a lot of women who were doing what I'm doing now. And so in a sense, it was somewhat liberating because we got to make our own rules, but I think it would have been a lot easier if I could have said, well, my goodness, what do you do if you are the first senior advisor to the President of the United States? And what are people's expectations of you? And I mean, oftentimes people early on discounted me because we were good friends. I've known the President and First Lady for 25 years now. And I wonder whether if I was a man, they would have said, oh, well, they're just friends, particularly given I had a pretty good career before I got here. So there are all kinds of issues that I would have liked to have talked through with someone who had been in my position. And so I spent a lot of time talking to young people, again, to my point in the beginning, to try to make your path a little bit easier, because I've learned a lot. I've learned some lessons the easy way, some lessons the hard way, but in the end, it worked out pretty well.
I'd say so. Who are your role models or mentors now?
Well, my friends have become my role models, and I have a lot of friends, and I have this conversation with one friend in particular, where at different points in your life, you can be the mentor, and then they can be the mentor. And in a sense, the best example of it is the President. I started out where the First Lady interviewed for a job to work in the mayor's office when I was there. And I just loved her immediately. She didn't like her law firm either, so we bonded on that immediately. She was interested in public service, and we had like a 20-minute interview. It was supposed to be 20 minutes. Hour and a half later, I'm offering her a job on the spot and didn't even check with my boss, the mayor, which is probably not so good. And so a couple days later, I said to her, well, what about that offer? And she says, my fiance does not like the idea. And I go, well, why not? And she says, well, he's not so, he's started as a community organizer, and he used to be putting pressure on government, and now I'd be inside government, and what would happen if he disagreed with something the mayor wanted to do, or I disagreed, who's going to be looking out for me? And I said, well, does that mean it's a no? She said, no, it means that he would like us to have dinner. And let's talk about it. The three of us have dinner. I thought, well, that's an interesting job interview. Now I'm the one getting interviewed. I get this. But I said, okay, sure. And so the three of us had dinner now, literally almost 25 years ago, I guess June this year. And so in the beginning, I was their mentor. And I was, worked on his first campaign. I chaired his finance committee when he ran for Senate. I was a senior advisor to his campaign when he ran for president. I co-chaired his transition committee when we came here. And now suddenly, he's the boss of me. And I remember when he first asked me about the job, I was like, well, I'm used to being the boss of you. And he said, yeah, but I would be the president of the United States. So if you got to have a boss, it's not a bad boss to have. And the same thing with the First Lady. And so I think what's interesting is in the course of your life, people who you started out mentoring as they grow up can easily be your mentors. And one of my best friends in Chicago, he and I have this conversation quite often. We have been each other's mentor our entire career. And he has been a strong advocate for women. And because he's a guy, he'll tell me how guys think. And he'll go, go in there and ask for something. But I will say one woman who was very helpful to me, and I will tell you about her in the context of something I think women do not do well. When I worked in the mayor's office, before I joined the mayor's office, I was in the corporation council as a lawyer for the city, and I didn't have a title, and I came from the law firm, and I was just really doing complex real estate transaction workouts primarily for some big ticket items that the city had, and she worked in the mayor's office, and so she was my client. And we would stay up late, and one wonderful thing she did is that she'd come to my home in the early evening so I could make dinner for my daughter and put my daughter to bed, and then we'd work after my daughter went to bed. And I realized, oh, she's getting a free dinner. Wasn't a bad deal, but it was so wonderful that she realized I had to get home and put my daughter to bed, and then I was free to work for another few hours. So after about maybe a year and a half, close to a year and a half maybe, not even that long maybe, I've lost track of time. After I'd been there a substantial enough period of time for me to get to know her really well, she said, you know, you should really go ask for promotion. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, the work you're doing is far more complex than what you are paid or your title. And I said, well, I didn't come here for a title. I could have stayed in the law firm. And she said, no, but you should be supervising more people, and you really should promote yourself. And it would never in my wildest dreams have occurred to me to ask for promotion. My thought was when my boss decided I was worthy of a promotion, he would give it to me, right? And until then, I would just work really hard. And she said, nonsense. That's nonsense. He's not going to even think about you unless you tell him this is what you deserve, because if you're satisfied in the cubicle facing the alley, that's where he's going to leave you. Really? You left that nice big office on the 79th floor of the Sears Tower looking at Lake Michigan? And I said, you know, but I'm okay in the cubicle. And she said, you shouldn't be okay unless you've decided for some other reason you can't excel. But if you think you can do better, march in there and ask him for a promotion. Well, the reason why she's my mentor is that I said, yeah, bad chance. Every week, have you gone in there? Have you gone in there? Have you asked Judd? What are you doing? And she just nodded at me until finally one day, terrified, I went in there. And I had my list of things that I had accomplished. And he was actually a friend of mine. I don't know why I was so nervous, except I thought he would say no, and it would be an awkward, feeling. So I went in and I said, well, Judd, I just want to talk to you. These are the things that I've been doing. My boss comes to me because she doesn't understand the complexity. And because I'd had that experience when I was in the private sector. And in fact, Lucille said, you don't want to be a peer with your boss. You want your boss to report to you. I thought that was crazy. But I said to Judd, I think actually I know more than Kathy does, and she's coming to me, and I think I should be a deputy. And I was terrified, and he looked at me and he said, okay. And I said, and I think I should move in that big office up in the suite by you that's been empty for a while. And he goes, no, there are other deputies that have seniority to you. And I go, well, how about I just move in until you figure out who gets it? Well, of course, I never moved out. But my point is that doesn't always happen. It's not always that easy. In retrospect, I probably should have asked for the promotion a year earlier. But you've got to be willing to take a little rejection and ask for it. And I've never met a man who didn't think, no offense to the few men in the room, I've never met a man who didn't think he was absolutely qualified for promotion his first day on the job. Not shy about asking for one, whether they are prepared for it or not. And we could do a lot better. And thanks to Lucille, I had the courage to go in there. And who knows, if it hadn't been, I might still be sitting. I was very happy in that cubicle, but this is much more comfortable than that. So speak up for yourself. That's my point. And let me be that mentor to you and that loud voice in your ear when you're wondering whether you should be brave enough. Because if he had said no, my feelings would have been hurt, but I could have come back in another 6 months, and I could have said to him, well, tell me what I should do to deserve it if I don't deserve it now, and take that feedback not as a rejection, but as constructive advice for how you can be better. It's a really important lesson to learn. So I try to always mention Lucille because she did me a huge favor and taught me how to do something that is hard and not intuitive, but important.
I love that you talked about that. So as a person that's about 4.5 years into my career, I think I can 100% say that today, being with you at the White House among these amazing women, that it's for sure one of the most surreal days of my life and of my career. So I have to ask you, what has been the most surreal moment of your career, or one of those moments?
There have been so many. I mean, really, almost every day here, I pinch myself. And I said to myself early on, if it ever gets to be unremarkable, it's time to go. And so the magic of working here is that you just meet and see people at these extraordinary moments. I was It's a little moment, but it's really impactful because oftentimes in the federal government, and I had always sworn I'd never work for the federal government because I always felt like it was so removed from what people were experiencing on the ground. And having worked in local government, I just felt like the federal government didn't care about us and they didn't understand us or anything like that. And so coming here at the federal government, I try to always keep in touch through this engagement with real people. And so I was mentioning earlier, we were, not to you, but to the prior group who was in here, that we were in Milwaukee a couple of weeks ago, and the president had lunch with this man who's 33 and who had been a big Republican, didn't support the president in his first election, actually worked and campaigned for Governor Romney in the second election, signed up for the Affordable Care Act because he didn't have insurance, and then got sick, very sick. And at age 33, he'd had 3 surgeries. And he said to the president, I was just wrong. And I am so sorry, I apologize for having not appreciated what you were trying to do for America. And so when you work really hard and you take a lot of crap and people are extremely critical, you're doing it knowing that that's going to happen, but you're taking that long view. And the president is really good at that. He's taught me, one of the main things I have learned from him is to recognize that between here and there's going to be a lot of pain along the way. And that part of leadership is learning how to absorb that pain and understanding that people don't always know the big picture of what you're trying to accomplish, and that change is terrifying to people. Even if it's change for the good, it can be really scary. And people resist it for reasons that are sometimes irrational, sometimes just the unknown is you'd rather have something and then take the chance on the unknown. And not necessarily knowing if it'll be better. And so the magic of our days are knowing that we're going to meet these people whose lives have been touched by what we've done, or they have, I'll give you another example. When we were trying to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the president's first term, which is the law that prevented people who were gay or lesbian from serving in the military. Well, you could serve, but you couldn't tell anybody you were gay. So it was literally, don't ask, don't tell. And if you did that, then you'd be okay. But I met with several servicemen and women who came to my office out of uniform. They had to sneak in, and they told me what their lives were like being gay, where you take this oath of honesty and love of country, and yet they couldn't even tell people who they really were. And it had such a profound impact on me and made me work even harder to have it repealed. And they were so frustrated and so angry with us because they wanted the president to just sign something and make it go away. And the president's view was he needed to give time for the military to get on board, because he thought if he could get them on board, then the lives of our gay service members would actually be better than if just abruptly he said, okay, we're going to let everybody stay, deal with it. And as a result, in the last several years since it was repealed, you haven't heard any terrible stories about gay servicemen and gay servicewomen. But I was profoundly affected by the people who came in and told me their stories. And so the magic of my day is really when you see people who are just truly inspirational and who remind us of why we're here. And so my best days are when people say, keep in mind, this is why you gave up whatever you had to come here and do this on behalf of the people. And I do suppose the day that the Affordable Care Act passed, and we were able to celebrate it upstairs on the Truman balcony and listen to everyone tell stories, really like stories of how hard it was and how we just didn't give up. And the president said that day meant more to him than the election day. And so those are the magic moments that we've had. And there have been, fortunately, many of them.
Definitely, and I recently watched the video of the young gentleman who was sick and how Obamacare changed his life, and it's so, so moving and testimony to what you were just saying. What is one mistake that you've made along the way throughout your career, and what did you learn from it?
Well, I shared the one earlier with you, which is being afraid to speak up for yourself, and I think that I've had the good fortune of having so many interesting either jobs or serving on boards. And I think early on, I often thought my questions were dumb questions. Have you ever had the experience where you're thinking about something and you go, well, that's probably not that's kind of a dumb question. there are no dumb questions. And I was on a board in the private sector once with a gentleman who is one of the wealthiest men in America, and we both joined the board at the same time, and I felt totally way out of my league to be on this board with him. And I was sitting in a board meeting and thinking about a question, and I thought, no, I can't ask that. He asked my question. I was like, that was my question. And I told him later, that was my question. He said, well, why didn't you ask it? And I said, I don't know, I thought it was a dumb question. And he said, there are no dumb questions. And so I think I lacked the confidence earlier in my career to just, if you're curious about something, it's okay. And I think I probably was traumatized in high school, or more likely in law school, when some guy laughed at me when I got called on and maybe I didn't have the best answer. And I think you just have to be resilient. And so those moments of insecurity, you just have to have the courage to overcome them. And to me, that's what courage is about. If you weren't afraid, then you wouldn't need courage. And courage is meaning you dig deep and you just go out there and you put yourself in the path of lightning, as my grandmother used to say. And I regret when I was younger that I didn't do it enough, that I didn't have the confidence to be like all the guys and just, I mean, in law school, I never raised my hand and really didn't like it when I got called on. I was very shy. Can you believe I was really shy? I mean, painfully shy. My mother had said, we'd go to dinner parties, and she'd say, you must turn your head and talk to the person on the other side of you. You just have to. And I was just shy. And I had to overcome it, and I had to learn how to do public speaking. I hated public speaking. And so I shied away from it. And so part of that same lesson I learned is that if you're not good at something, know it, and then figure out, well, how do I get good at it? And it's just practice. And so being willing to look at yourself, be self-critical, and not shy away from things that you're uncomfortable doing is part of the growth process.
Speaking of resilience, what has been your hardest day at the White House?
Well, that's easy. That was really 2 days. It was the day that we heard about those 20 young babies and 6 adults in Newtown. And I was in the Oval Office when we found out how many people were killed that day. And I remember the president said 26. And I said, 26? He said, yeah, 20 children and 6 adults. Somebody had passed him a note. And I simply couldn't process it. I mean, I really couldn't take it in. And then a couple of days later, I went with the president to Newtown. And we think about it, it's still so fresh. And they had a memorial service for all the families. And the president, we got in the car. We had to drive from the airport, an hour and 10 minutes, to where the memorial service was being held. And we get in the car together, and he looks at his speech. And, you know, I kind of left him alone while he was reading it. So about 2 minutes later, he said, hand me the yellow pad. And I said, why? And he said, I can't give that speech. That's not what I want to say. And his speechwriters had prepared a speech. And so for the next hour and 10 minutes, he took out and a handwritten on a yellow pad, wrote from the heart what he wanted to say. And just think about it. What do you say to people 2 days after their children have been murdered, or even to the adults who just 2 days earlier had lost their loved ones? And he found the words to really just not only recognize their extraordinary pain, but also celebrate their sense of community and resilience. And so I remember I wasn't even breathing in the car because I didn't want to distract him from what he was writing. And he finished it as we pulled up. He hands it to one of his staff, and he said, have this typed up. That's going to be my speech. So he never read it again from the time he wrote it. And then he went around and met with every family that was there. And I'm telling you, as we would walk in the room, I had to just steel myself as a mom to what that experience would be. And he took his time, and he talked to all of them, and I followed behind him and talked to the families. He talked to the first responders, and too often we ignore the trauma that our first responders go through, but just painfully imagine for a second what it must have been like for them to arrive on the scene. The governor was there, who realized when all of the parents had picked up their children, when the children came to this auditorium, parents reunited with their children, and then you're left with 20 sets of parents. And the governor realized that he was going to be the one who had to tell them what had happened. He wasn't prepared for that. he still talks about how extraordinarily hard that was. And so it was a devastating day as a mom, as somebody who was watching the president try to comfort families and siblings. I remember one young child showed me a photograph of, she was a twin, a photograph of her with her brother. It was a real close-up, and you could just see his beautiful eyes. And she wasn't old enough to fully understand what had happened, but she's beginning to understand now. And we have maintained friendships with many of those folks. And for example, Mark Barton has started Sandy Hook Promise, which is a not-for-profit that helps to educate how to recognize mental illness in schools. And so he's trying to take his grief and turn it into something constructive. And that's been what's so heartening, is to see people on the worst day of their life and then see them over the weeks and months and years that follow and appreciate the strength that they have to choose the path of being responsible for making society better, as opposed to the path that just leaves you into the terrible grief that would be totally understandable for people to have. So it was the worst day by far, and the relationships that came out of it, and our complete commitment still to do everything within our power to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them is steadfast. And the fact that they have joined us in this effort, having gone through the worst possible loss themselves, is nothing short of remarkable.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that.